Okay, we're going to launch right into the first panel discussion of the day. I'm going to invite Carl Yagnema and Scott Griffith to come up to the stage with me. Hopefully you guys are both mic'd up. So I see Carl and awesome, I see Scott. Okay, I'm going to grab my mask. And just a reminder on the hey Scott. Hey Carl, good to see you. Oh, let's get you mic'd up. These guys over here can take care of that. Thanks, Scott. Just a reminder on our format for the day. The first four topics are sort of rapid fire panel and then roundtable. So what do we mean by that? This will be the panel, which is a combination of both live and virtual folks, and on top, and then we will combine as well. And by the way, do we have Jody connected in? I see. There she is. Good morning, Jody. Okay, we have no audio, but we'll get it. We'll get it. We're working on that. So just getting back to the format. So we're going to have these discussions quickly, and then you guys are going to discuss at your separate tables what you just heard, introduce each other, discuss what you just heard, and try to identify any specific gaps in knowledge. Okay, so let's just kick this off. So I'm gonna start with you, Carl. So welcome. What we would like to talk about on this panel. So I'm going to ask you to quickly introduce yourself. And the subject for the panel is really this. We've been hearing so much about robotaxis. And I'd say we heard so much about robotaxis, and now there seems to be a renaissance of more about robotaxis. So we're going to try to kind of dive into that a little bit and look for, where do we see the opportunities for value creation in this kind of robotaxi dynamic. And so why don't you quickly introduce yourself, Carl,
Sure.
to the group.
Yeah, well, first, thanks for inviting me to participate in the panel, John. Getting a little nostalgic. I spent the first half of my career over in Building 35, yep. So nice to be back at MIT. I'm the president and CEO of Motional. Motional is a business based here in Boston that's focused on developing technology for level 4 driverless fleets. We're about 1,200 or so employees, Boston, Pittsburgh, Singapore, Seoul, and Las Vegas and other sites. So very happy to be here and looking forward to the discussion.
Awesome. Okay. So tell us a little bit about, and by the way, your presence at MIT remains. I think I sent you a photo like about 18 months ago of your door still hanging out in one of those buildings. So you've moved on, but your door remains
good to know.
enshrined at MIT. Tell us a little bit about what you guys are doing with this project in Las Vegas. You have a big presence there.
Yeah.
Tell us about that evolution.
Yeah, Vegas has been a really important site for us. We have been operating for about the past 4 years in collaboration with Lyft, with Jody there on the screen, and colleagues, one of the world's longest standing, open to the public, commercial self-driving services. So if you go to Vegas today, if you were to get on a plane after this meeting and open your Lyft app, you'd have a chance to hail one of our Motional vehicles. Call the car, it shows up and takes you where you want to go in the Strip or downtown Las Vegas. We have to date delivered well over 100,000 rides. 98% of those rides have been 5 stars out of 5, so it's just a normal Lyft trip. We get a rating like everybody else. So it's been a great experience. It's been a great learning experience for us as a business. That feedback, putting this technology in front of the public, there's no substitute for that, for our product learnings and our technology development. Now that service today is a self-driving service. There's what we call a vehicle operator sitting behind the wheel, just monitoring the system, hands off the wheel, hands off the brakes and the pedals. In 2023, that will transition to a fully driverless service. So we announced last week that Las Vegas will be our first fully driverless commercial site. Again, that will be in partnership with Lyft.
I just need to pause here. I love this emphasis on fully driverless autonomous vehicles.
Right.
So let's just, what the distinction there is like
Yeah.
taking out the kind of the test driver, right?
Safety, the vehicle operators, we call it. No one in the car. So an
safety
empty vehicle
override.
picks you up and takes you to your destination.
Yep.
You know, the industry has been going through different transitions. There was an R&D phase, which arguably we're kind of at the tail end of. And then there's this early commercialization phase that we're kind of in the middle of now. And part of that transition is this shift to driverless. There's a very small number of businesses around the world that have demonstrated that fully driverless capability, the confidence in the safety and integrity of the system to actually have no one behind the wheel, to have it operating safely as an empty system. So we've been doing that for about a year or so, and we'll be putting that in front of members of the public in 2023.
Awesome. So what do you see as maybe the realistic, I know you must get this question all the time, but what sort of time frame are we talking about and for, let's say, some sort of scalable model where we actually have some significant percentage of driverless fleets of vehicles on the road in a particular city?
It's a good question. You know, the question 3 years ago is, do driverless vehicles exist, right?
Yeah.
Can we make a driverless vehicle? Is the technology real? And so that question's been answered. There are driverless vehicles on the road in numerous cities around the world today. So we've moved past that. Now the question is when do we get to scale? So I mentioned 2023 as an initial market.
Yep.
The answer to the question is it depends where you live. It depends what city you're in. Because this technology will very much be deployed on a city-by-city basis. I think at one point there was a little bit of a kind of a false notion that we'd wake up one day and see driverless vehicles everywhere all the time, no matter where you lived. And that's not the way the technology works. We're constrained by the operating conditions, what we call the operational domain, the complexity of the driving environment in a particular city, the weather, the regulatory environment, among other things. So it depends where you live.
Yep.
If you're in a certain city, if you're in Las Vegas, if you're in San Francisco, if you're in Austin, you'll have access to driverless vehicles within the next few years.
What about China? Would you say that they're maybe ahead of the game, at par, or lagging?
It's tough to say. I don't have great visibility into everything that's happening in China. I will say the technology among a small set of kind of leading players, so the industry has consolidated, but among that small set, the technology has advanced, I wouldn't say fully apace, but everyone's making progress.
Yeah.
And I suspect we see the same in China.
Okay. And then just finally on this question of maybe societal value, right? So whenever you talk about value, you have to talk about value for whom, right? So how are we meeting, let's say, those goals, you know, safe, clean, inclusive? Probably a lot that these fleets could do toward inclusivity.
Sure.
Just tell me a little bit how you're thinking about that.
Well, you know, first of all, we think of value in all those various dimensions. It's interesting, one of the first things we learned in Vegas, you know, I'm a technologist. We're building technology. Our business is primarily engineers. You know, people don't care about technology.
Yeah.
98% of our trips 5-star out of 5. We focus on the 2% that aren't.
Yep.
And what are people complaining about? No one talks about technology. They talk about the fact that the ride, maybe there wasn't enough space in the back seat. They talk about not enough trunk space for their luggage. They talk about if the ride was a little bit uncomfortable. People really want a ride that's safe, that's efficient, and that's cheap. That's what they want. We as a business want to serve the greatest transportation demand that we can, which by construction means it should be an inclusive service. Right. The great thing about autonomous vehicles, and one of many, is that they're going to be without bias. We're going to go where the demand is. That's not the case for today's transportation systems. There may be demand in pockets of a city that's not served because drivers don't want to go there. There was a comment made by one of the previous speakers about the great opportunity of balancing supply and demand through analytics. And that is fantastic. You know, one of the things that got me very excited very early on about autonomous vehicles was a study that was done by one of my former colleagues and co-founder of a startup, former MIT professor named Emilio Frizzoli. He did a study on transportation in Singapore. Mm-hmm. He showed that if you were to replace Singapore's fleet of 900,000 privately owned vehicles at that time, this was a few years ago, if you were to place them with fully autonomous systems that were optimizing their positioning to respond to demand, you could serve the transportation needs of Singapore with 300,000 vehicles.
One
So a
third.
reduction of 2/3. And so that promise on transport efficiency, you combine that with a green fleet.
Yep.
And speaking to the accessibility topic that we just touched on, and you've got a technology that promises to kill multiple birds with one stone, and that's one of the reasons that people like me are so excited.
Awesome. All right. We're going to move on to Scott. And by the way, could maybe somebody grab a water in the back for Carl, just so everybody has water up here. Scott, so Carl, you have a connection to Boston. Scott, you have a connection to Boston as well as your former days as the CEO of Zipcar. Now you're in Dearborn, Michigan. So tell us a little bit about your, thank you so much. Thank you, Jinhua. Tell us a little bit about your current role.
Sure. So I'm CEO of Ford's autonomous vehicle business and what we call their mobility businesses. We own the Spin Scooter business. We have some software platform operations that are transit routing and routing systems. So it's set up as a separate entity intentionally so we can sort of innovate and not always have to succumb to all the governance that big companies have. And I've been there for about 2 years, 2 years ago in November. Moved to Detroit from Wellesley after building, well, I was at General Catalyst. And by the way, I'll tell the story. The last time I saw Carl in a serious meeting, it was a pitch meeting for his company.
That's right. Yeah.
And I could not get the partners at
You
General
guys passed.
Catalyst
That's right.
to do the deal. So this one's on my wall of shame. I knew this guy was going to kill it, so we just couldn't get it done. And then I think Bob Davis did it at Highland, and I think that worked out pretty well for Bob and not so well for General Catalyst, by the way.
Chris did too.
There, Fontanellis, there it is. Anyway, so I was here for a long time building Zipcar for about 10.5 years, and the conversation this morning reminds me of 2003, I think, when I first joined Zipcar. And we had a mission statement that said more car sharers than car owners in big cities around the world. That was sort of our mission statement in the early days, and that was the first slide in our Series A pitch deck. And so after 18 years of doing this, it's exciting to see autonomous now become part of that ecosystem, micromobility becoming part of that ecosystem. So that's sort of the Ford vision. It's not just a single mode, it's multi-mode, it's mobility, it's not cars. And that's why we're set up as a mobility and AV business together. And we'll get into some more details.
So tell us a little bit about what you guys are up to, also with Lyft in Austin and Miami.
So first off, we think of ourselves, in fact, and I think Carl got to this, the best analogy that I can think of for what autonomous is going to look like is an airline. It's a lot of stakeholders. There's even public entities that get involved. Pickup and drop off has a lot of public interaction. And so Ford, I think of Ford as the big integrator of all of those systems and stakeholders that have to come together. Yes, we build the vehicles, and yes, we'll run the back end. But our tech partner is Argo in Pittsburgh. Many of you probably know of Argo, Brian Selesky. We helped Brian start the company a number of years ago. And we've now committed over the next 4 years, between now and 2025. Outside of Argo, we'll spend about $7 billion getting ready for scale. So, and I agree with Carl's points about where we are in terms of R&D versus, I'll say, early commercialization and real scale. And our view, which it sounds pretty similar, is 2025 to 2030 is probably when you're going to really see some scale. We'll see hybrid fleets with AVs and driven vehicles for many, many years. It's hard for me to imagine a point where it's all AVs at this point, just because the ODD, the technology and policy constraints around some areas are just going to be tough. So we're starting off with Argo. Our early 2 partners on the demand side, we do not intend to be in the demand generation business, at least not for now. We're spending a lot of money getting ready to partner with Lyft, and we also announced Walmart. We'll be launching
why Walmart? What are you doing there?
Package delivery,
Yep.
last mile package delivery.
Okay.
That starts later this year. Lyft will start later this year. Lyft in Miami, and so we operate, I think, one of the larger footprint of cities, testing, getting ready for scale. 6 different cities now, and we have 3 more that we haven't announced that we're building infrastructure in right now. So we really think that there's all this talk about first to pull the driver, first to do this. We think first to scale is really important in this space. So we're preparing the infrastructure in what we think will be early adopting, very important cities, mostly in the US and 2 in Europe, to be prepared for scale.
Scott, just to clarify, what is that infrastructure that you're referring to?
It's first of all, it's getting all the stakeholders in cities and policymakers, sort of on board with the idea of how this is going to work. Yep. And then it's big fleet operations. In the beginning of next year, we'll open what I think is probably the biggest AV operating center in maybe the world, but certainly in this country, in Miami, near Miami Airport. We've been working on that infrastructure for almost 2 years now. So when I first started, one of the first things I did. Mm-hmm. And inside that building is a high-tech maintenance area, basically, to run these fleets. Back to my airline analogy, uptime, safety, cleanliness, customer experience are all super key. And we've actually been working with Delta Airlines and other, I think, really great operators to understand what does it take to run that uptime and have a great customer experience at the same time. So we've partnered with Lyft now. Yep. And they'll be, just like Carl's interactions in Vegas, in Miami, you'll open the Lyft app and you'll see a Ford Argo AV available for rides in the next month or two.
Right. Well, super exciting. You're using my favorite word, integration. I love this concept of kind of the airline analogy, right? That, you have a fleet of vehicles. We're thinking of the future as the big shift away from personally owned automobiles to someone else, be it Lyft or some other entity, operates these autonomous fleets. And as you point out, there needs to be some mechanism to clean those vehicles, maintain those vehicles, and so forth.
Calibration, eventually charging. Our first vehicle is a hybrid. This will be the only vehicle that has an ICE engine in it that Ford Motor Company builds as an AV. We're now developing our second and third vehicles, and those will be 100% EVs. So we're out of the ICE business, and that's intentional. We do know a lot about the B2B space. It's an interesting stat. 50% of all light-duty commercial vehicles in the United States carry a Ford Blue Oval. So we know a lot about operating, large, high-intensity vehicles, not on our own, but so we're learning a lot from our customers who are doing that and leveraging that learning as we develop the AV business.
Super exciting. Okay, I think I sat in the wrong place. I'm going to just pick up and move right next to you so I have a better view on Jody. And Jody, thank you so much for joining us. My gosh, it's early in the morning in San Francisco, so
My first question is, can you hear me? Is the audio working?
Yes, beautifully. So, all right, first accomplishment. So, Jody, maybe, I should say all three on this panel have a connection to Boston. Maybe you can share your connection to Boston.
Yeah, so I will say, I'm sorry I can't be there in person today. The reason is that I am from Boston and I'm coming home for Thanksgiving next week and couldn't quite pull off an earlier trip. So I always find this to be a amazing story when I think back on how far we've come. But Carl and I met, I think, on one of my early trips home to Boston around a Thanksgiving trip. And I was sort of a year into my time at Lyft, and we were starting to think about sort of how do we want to engage with this new sort of technology that is autonomous vehicles. And I cold emailed Emilio, who's Carl's former co-founder, and ended up basically learning everything I know from the two of them. So it's a great honor to be on this panel with both Carl and Scott. I think we are incredibly lucky as Lyft to have two such, I would say, forward-looking and also collaborative partners. And I think that's a word that hopefully will come up a lot. I think at Lyft, we view by the way, hi, I'm Jody Kelman. I lead autonomous at Lyft. I realized I did not. I'm the head of Lyft Autonomous.
I was going to ask you, Jody, but please tell us your role at Lyft.
So my job is basically to partner with folks like Carl and Scott to bring best-in-class self-driving technology to Lyft riders. So we really view ourselves as sort of a core part of the trust equation as we are transitioning to this new technology in early days. So think about, that 10 years ago, would you have gotten into a car with a stranger because an app told you to do that? Lyft is very comfortable with the world of sort of transitioning people to new technologies, but then ultimately really being a part of what Scott talked about, which is demand generation, and really saying, no, ultimately we want to be in a position where we are able to get vehicles off the road. What that means is being able to utilize the vehicles effectively, and what that means is being able to sort of throw a fire hose of optimized demand at these autonomous vehicle provider, or at these autonomous vehicles. And so we're incredibly excited to be bringing this technology to our riders today in Vegas with Carl, and soon to be in Miami with Scott and the Ford and Argo teams. And it's going to be, I think, a really interesting sort of transition of how industries even work together over time, because this problem is just far too big for any of us to be able to solve alone.
I love that emphasis on partnership. All three of you have mentioned it, and I mentioned it in the introduction. I mean, it's just it's characteristic of this mobility system. It is sort of messy ecosystem of partnerships and acquisitions, and even for Lyft, you've gone through an evolution where I believe Lyft really invested in building up their own autonomous business, which was recently sold off to Woven, which is part of the really affiliated with Toyota. Maybe tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so and by the way, I think there may be some people in your audience who are what we call level 5, which was Lyft's self-driving division. Yeah. So I think it's fair to say, frankly, that there's some, I would call it rationalization in the market right now. It's sort of, Lyft, what we do is we are a network. So we connect, supply a driver or a bike or a scooter or an autonomous vehicle to demand, to a rider, and help them get that sort of effective, efficient transportation trip completed on the Lyft network. And, I think when we looked at this ecosystem probably 5 years ago, there was a real question of whether sort of the market was going to evolve into a series of vertically integrated players, right? So a series of self-driving companies that also wanted to run their own demand generation as well, run their own ride-hailing networks. And there was also a question of how many really strong autonomous vehicle players were going to get to market. Mm-hmm. So I think, what's been really exciting for us is to see, frankly, that the industry is as healthy as it is, which means that, frankly, Lyft can focus on what it does incredibly well, which is build great consumer technology and great marketplaces, and allow, particularly companies that have I think of it as kind of the magic 2 parts, which are a really strong OEM and a really strong self-driving system provider, to build that self-driving technology that's going to be able to come to market on Lyft.
Jody, you used the word network instead of the word platform. Was that by design?
It was by design. So we don't, we think of the Lyft network really as being almost a series of connected nodes across different kinds of transportation. So we want, a rider to be, I think Scott talked a little bit about this as well. We want someone to be able to open up the Lyft app and really, the moment that they request a Lyft bike or a scooter, they might be relying on a back end that includes, bike and scooter fleet management systems that are powering sort of that integrated ecosystem. And so I think Lyft has evolved from something that looks much more like a platform, just a plug and play, where we are saying that we're bringing supply and demand together, to being an integrated network where we're able to say, okay, we'll actually bring all of the pieces of the puzzle to this. So from the fleet management capabilities that we've developed around managing our fleet of express drive vehicles, which are basically cars we rent to drivers, to the marketplace optimization that is powering all of the work that we're doing with autonomous vehicle fleets today. We really think of that as sort of more powerful than something that just looks like a series of APIs where you can kind of plug in, plug and play, and sort of go forward on.
It's a super interesting and I think super important distinction, sort of an evolution, if you will. One last question for you, Jody. Let's talk just a little bit about value. So what excites you about this opportunity that you see with these partnerships in terms of delivering real value for people?
Well, so I have an image that I keep in my mind when I am thinking about why I do this every day, because it's a long road. I have been at this since 2016, which is frankly a relatively significant chunk of my career. And I think we're still, both other panelists have talked about this, we're years away from true scale. So the image that I have in my mind is of the moment I had to take away my grandparents' car keys, and sort of what that meant for them in terms of a loss of freedom. And my mom, hopefully she will forgive me for revealing this sort of to a large audience, but my mom is 69. So I feel like I have roughly a decade and a half to be able to make sure that there are self-driving cars at scale in the two places she lives, which are Boston and Miami. So I have the perfect
You're on a personal
people.
mission.
In all seriousness, I mean, I very much keep the sort of people whose lives are going to be affected by this, and my mom is my mental model, but the people whose lives are going to be changed by this as my kind of North Star, because there are going to be these massive secondary effects, right, around safety of the population, energy efficiency of our fleets, environmental impact on built environments and cities. But I think for me, the sort of this personal motivation of really saying, we are going to have a generation that ages out of their own cars right as this technology is coming to market. To me, it's transformative. You basically, you give people an extra 10 years of life. And so that's what I keep in mind when I am thinking about sort of our road ahead and how we build. I'm bringing Scott and Carl into this with, attempting to virtually, but how we build this ecosystem that's going to be able to really make sure that she stays the incredibly vibrant, independent person that she is.
Awesome. Any reflections from you guys, Scott?
Look, I think very touching to hear that, Jody. And the personal connection, I think, isn't lost on any of us. I mean, I think everyone in this room has had someone who's known someone or been close to someone whose lives have been impacted by an auto accident. I know I have. And so, again, the safety dimension, the accessibility dimension, I think it's uncommon that you see a single technology that can have so many societal positives. To me, it's proportional that it should be hard to do. If it were easy, we would have done it a long time ago. So excited to be part of the the journey.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, just by virtue of reaching some success and then some scale, as this scales up, there will be giant societal benefits that come from it. It'll be a big change. It'll be a lot of policy changes, and the thing I would just end with is, it's been amazing to me. I mentioned I've been in this since 2003 at Zipcar. In the last 24 months or 18 months, cities have done things that we all thought they should have done for 20 years, and COVID gave them the courage to do it. And I think now we're seeing, lane takeaways and one-way streets developed and green spaces open up in ways that, to me, fit the mental image that Jody was describing, that there's equity, there's freedom, but you don't have to own vehicles, and there's micromobility that combines with that.
Yep.
And so I think
Incredible point, yeah, bringing in these new modes.
it's just, to me, that what's happened over the last 12 or 18 months because of COVID in major cities is quite incredible.
Right.
They've taken steps that we all thought they should for many years. They just weren't ready to do it. So to me, and I don't think we're going back. So I think that's really exciting too. And Jody, I love the story about your mom. I think we're going to call it Project Jody's Mom from now on.
Right.
So cool. That's a great one.
Super. Okay, so here's what we're going to do right now. So Jody, you're going to stay on in our virtual Zoom roundtable with a number of participants there. Scott is going to come down to one of these tables here and lead a table discussion. And Carl is going to make a run for the airport to head to Los Angeles. And you all are going to give a round of applause for all of our panelists.